So the African continent is receiving a small proportion of global funding for climate change research. According to researcher Professor Guy Midgley, this is despite the continent producing 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. He joins us now for the very latest and to understand why the continent is not getting as much funding as it should. Professor Midgley, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. What do we need to understand about climate change funding for the global south, in particular the continent?
Well, the most important thing is that our continent is least responsible for the causes of climate change, but is experiencing the first and the worst adverse effects, which affect everybody, particularly poor people and people who are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And that is a grossly unfair situation. And we need to do our own science in order to figure out how best we can adapt, how best we can adjust our lifestyles or benefit from all the assets that we have, the natural assets that we have, in order to build resilience to climate change. But even though we only produce 2% of the emissions, experience all the effects, we get less than 3% of the global cut of funding into this kind of research. And being the biggest continent and the most adversely affected, least responsible, that seems grossly, grotesquely unfair.
Even the contention that we contribute 2% of emissions, how do you then trust research that is not done by you, or at least do we know whether the research has come to the continent and conducted this research? Is it desktop research? I guess essentially my question is, how then can we trust these swathes of research and studies that are put before us about us if we're not involved in it?
That's one point. The other issue is that we often are presented with solutions that are developed elsewhere and in different kinds of climates, and get sort of laid on the table here as if they would apply here. Not eating meat, for example. For many parts of Africa, production of meat is very sustainable, and in fact contributes possibly to carbon storage, because the animals maintain a carbon cycle where they're grazing. And there are many, many other. Planting trees in the wrong places. Everybody thinks that planting trees is a natural solution to climate change. Well, it's not. If you plant trees on a grassland, which is maintaining water and supporting grazing livelihoods, you condemn those people to generations of looking after trees that don't belong there. You alter their livelihoods for generations. So these northern hemisphere developed solutions don't necessarily work here, and and we have a natural advantage in the world, because this is one of the best places to study climate and global change, because we have this incredible southern ocean to the south of us and all these biomes and ecosystem types which can teach us so much. The world sends its researchers here, but very little of the funding remains here and funds our own researchers. It funds other people to get PhDs and take them back home.
You spoke of planting trees in the wrong places. What do we need to know about this influence campaign? It speaks of non-endemic Australian eucalyptus trees being planted on the continent.
Yeah, Australian eucalypts are one of the favorite fast-growing trees that are proposed to store carbon. But when you plant those trees on grasslands, they use water that would have flowed down into our rivers, for example, in the Drakensberg area, and they feed our rivers and they feed our economy. So you're basically storing carbon for people who are emitting too much and taking the losses down here, which are not really factored in. And we don't get paid enough to do it anyway. So there's a lot of sort of worms in that can when you open it, and because we don't get enough funding to really understand these things and to build our local capacity to understand them, we tend to be the receivers of these maladaptation processes, these maladaptation solutions.
Do we not have the money, the capacity, whatever it is that is needed to do our own funding? Maybe I get confused because every year you've got the climate change talks where leaders and some on the continent, a few on the continent, will charter a flight to go wherever in the world to speak about this. So what are we putting to the table?
Well, I don't think we're negotiating effectively. We do use our own funding, but that is unfair. Why should we, as people who are being damaged by climate change, have to invest more than the global average into climate change research? We would rather invest that money into other forms of research. We should be getting a much fairer deal in the global funding space to fund climate change research. We shouldn't have to be deviating our own funds into climate change research. We do that. We have to do that. We're forced to do it. So if you look at the global average, we spend far more of our research vote on climate change research than the global average. And that's wrong, because we should be spending far less, because it's not a problem of our own making.
Yeah.
It's grossly unfair. And, for some reason, we're unable to make that point hard enough in the international negotiations and trigger the kind of funding, the proper funding that will build a sustainable careers, because we need African scientists who will serve this continent for decades to come. This is a problem that's not going to go away for decades. And we're not building that capacity. We're not building the institutions, the strength and strengthening the capacity. It's waning, and we're running out of time.
Scary. So who needs to do what?
Well, our negotiators in the international spaces need to be tougher. I think we've got an incredible value proposition to offer the international community because we can do amazing research here. We've just got to structure the agreements to allow more funds to flow to actual African scientists and to stay on the continent in the form of equipment that's left behind or capacity building, whatever the case may be. We're missing an opportunity to negotiate better and leverage better, both in the political space and in the science policy space.
Prof, thank you very much for your time. Professor Guy Midgley is the director at Stellenbosch University School for Climate Studies.